What's up, guys? So in this video I'm actually going to be explaining how to cut a card, because I think it's a skill that's really important and can kind of be done very different ways by a lot of people, but I'm kind of explain both from my experience doing LD for 2 years and then now doing PF for the last 2 years, what I've found is most important, what the goal is when you're cutting a card, and then also kind of how to do it as quickly as possible, and also what I'm looking for when I'm cutting a card. So today I'm going to be pretending that I'm looking for a card in regards to the current PF topic, which is, should the U.S. government prioritize reducing the federal debt or promoting economic growth? And so for this I'm going to be on the affirmative side, talking about, really I'm just looking for impacts about public opinion. So essentially I'm looking for something that talks about how currently public opinion isn't being heard very well, but maybe something that talks about as well that public opinion is important, and that overall, essentially I'm saying that by voting for my side, we hear 100% of the public, and doing so essentially as I show through polls, and then from there justifying why that's important and why currently maybe the perception of public opinion isn't that great. So I'm going to go ahead and, essentially this article that I found that I ended up reading in a case, I just was Googling for just different stuff about representation, how we listen to constituents, whether representatives listen to constituents, and so I ended up stumbling across this article. It's actually on JSTOR, so what I would go ahead and do is open it in JSTOR. I would end up having to log into my account, and then from there, I can also I'll go ahead and share this I'll share this login with my own novices, and I think you guys can kind of pass it on too. But basically, essentially what I would do is I would log in to the JSTOR account that I have, and then from there I would be able to kind of see a preview of the article. I always like to open it as a PDF, so I'd click here on download PDF, and it would allow me to open it essentially as a full PDF, so that way it's easy for me to Control F for what I want to look for. So essentially, is what I usually start with before I even Control F, is with these really long, scholarly articles that are pretty much research papers. I go all the way down to conclusion, because a lot of these papers use a lot of complex math calculations that aren't the easiest to understand or explain if you don't know kind of why or how they were coming to the conclusions, or what they were doing exactly, what they're studying. So because of that, I always start at the conclusion, because it explains most bluntly what the authors are finding. So as I explained, I'm looking for something that says that public opinion is heard by representatives, Congress, or some form of representation, and that currently, at least the way that it's being heard, isn't great for all Americans. It's not equal. So I would start reading the conclusion. We can see first it talks about how essentially citizens' priorities are different in different spheres, how they can kind of manifest differently. It goes on to talk about building on past studies have shown that citizens' priorities and representation differ, so everyone is different, quite obviously. Some of these usually starts pretty obvious and pretty bluntly explaining just some, oh yeah, it's pretty obvious, so that it can lead directly into their more immediate and more important conclusions. So then from there, it says that we also show that relationships are particularly strong in competitive districts, meaning that in competitive districts, representatives are listening to their constituents a lot more. So then I'm going down, I'm saying, yeah, that's good, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for. But then here's where I really find what I want. So it says results that they have compiled, or essentially compiled what they've found, is that for a number of reasons, that elected officials are responsive to their constituents' preferences, they're responsive to their most salient preferences, and that they're responsive to their constituents' higher order preferences about significance of policy responsiveness versus other spheres of representation. So that sounds really good to me. Essentially what it's saying is elected officials not only respond to preferences, they respond to strong preferences, but they listen in the order of the importance of a preference. And this right here, this higher order, means a lot to me, because the poll that I'm using polls about 15 or 20 different things that are important to the constituents, but it goes in order of what's most important to least important. And what I feel in regards to public opinion, which is reducing the deficit, is important, and what I'm advocating for is actually the number 2 priority, which means that these representatives are going to listen because it is such an important preference. And this also is important because it talks about they are much more responsive in the policy that they make to their constituents versus other spheres, such as maybe if the NRA wants them to pass guns or pass some sort of gun rights, and they give them money, or the GOP wants them to stick with their caucus or whatever. Overall, what these representatives are most responsive to is their constituents' concerns, which is really good. That's what I want. But as I go down further, I also find that what's important to recognize is not everyone's voice is heard equally. And so as it goes down, I'm kind of using it explains that it's just kind of a more like it's kind of a political science question that maybe research is moving towards it, but that there have been findings, and this is really critical, that wealthy citizens are better represented than middle income and poor Americans, and it goes on further to say that other sources find that racial and ethnic minorities' policy preferences are not represented as well as those of whites. So if I was actually cutting this card, I would go ahead and go read through pretty much the rest of the conclusion. As of right now, I'm not going to, just for the sake of time. But what's most important here is that kind of I understand the warrant as to why these minorities and why these poor Americans aren't being listened to as well. And the reason, essentially I want to find a warrant, I want to find the reason, and so I'd probably keep reading just for that. So it says that our results suggest that disparities in representation across demographic groups may occur in part because citizens prioritize policy representation and other facets of representation differently, and elected officials are sensitive to these differences. Essentially what that's saying is that some people are more involved in politics than others, which is why maybe racial minorities aren't as involved in politics, so their voice isn't heard as much. That's essentially what this is saying, and that's critical because that gives me a warrant as that I can explain in the round. If my opponent asks me, well, why aren't black people being listened to as well as white people, or why aren't poor people being listened as well to as rich people? So let's go ahead, is what I would go ahead and do, is I will start probably about here, because that's what I'm looking for. That's when it starts saying what I want, and cut all the way to the bottom. And then while doing this, I want to make sure as well that it's important that you cut in paragraphs, so I can't just stop in the middle of a paragraph. I want to include everything, because a lot of times my opponents are going to want it in context, so I don't have to Google the article. Instead, I can just show them, hey, it starts like right here. This is what you're looking for, and you can kind of read it in the context of everything else. Okay, cool. So it was a little dicey. This one is one of the few articles I've ever found that it's not clear what exactly you're highlighting, but it ended up cutting it correctly. So I think it left out a few words here, but I'm not that concerned about it because it's just a quick cut. If I was checking, I might make sure that every single word is the same. But even if my opponent asks, I can literally just show them the article and they can read the whole thing if they need it. So what's critical about verbatim is I can push one button, F12, and it takes away all of the formatting. So if there was a hyperlink, if there was spaces, if there was underline, whatever, it all goes away. And then I can press F3, which means that if it was in paragraphs, like if there's a paragraph here, and I want it all to be condensed, I can just highlight all of what I want it to be condensed, press F3, and it puts it all together. So then from here, while I'm starting to cut the card, before I even do that, I always want to do a couple of things. The first is I want to copy and paste the link of the article, so that way I don't forget it in case I accidentally close the tab, that I still have it. And then the other thing I'm going to do is copy and paste what I need to read in the round. And that is going to be first the author names, so I'll just go to this cover page, copy and paste the author names here. I will highlight the last names because that's what I have to read in the round. If there's two authors, I read both last names. I say Griffin and Flavin. If there's multiple authors, I would say, if like three or more, I would say Griffin et al., and then I would say the year. So of course I need the year as well. Looking at this article, it's not on the cover page. It's also not on the very first page of the article. I do see this copyright in 2011, so I'm guessing that would be the year, but just to make sure, I would go ahead and go back to Google, and it will explain, right here it gives me the author, and it also gives me the year. So that verifies that the most recent year on this article was 2011, so then I would just type in 2011 right here, and I will actually only highlight the 11 because that's all I have to say in round. So it's unlike your English class in the sense you don't have to write a full MLA citation. It never hurts, but it saves you a lot of time now that you can use Wi-Fi in round, to just highlight the last names of the people that wrote the article, highlight the year that it was written. You only have to write 99 or 04 or 05 or 17. You have to say the full year, and then include the link so that if someone in the round asks, can I see the full article? Can I see what you read in context? Can I see anything really? You can just pull up the link and give it to them, or email it to them, or do whatever you need to do. So then after I've done that, I'm ready to start cutting my card and looking for essentially what my tag is. So normally I'll write my tag after, but just for the sake of showing you what I'm cutting for, I went ahead and left the tag in that I'd already written. Also, if you're wondering why there's a first here, essentially I'm reading this card as the first impact to why it's good, to what happens when we listen to the public and reduce the deficit. And so essentially that's why the first is characterizing this as my first impact. So as I get on to cutting, I'm going to go to the two most important sentences that I found. The first was about their initial results that say that representatives listen to their constituents. So I'm going to go ahead and cut. It says results show that elected officials are responsive to the constituents' preferences, and especially their most salient preferences, and I'm not going to be cutting those sites because I don't need it, but also to the constituents' higher order preferences about the policy responsiveness. And so this is just my first cut, but what's most important to remember when you're cutting is that you are not starting with the whole article or the whole couple paragraphs that you pasted and trying to reduce it down and reduce it down. Rather, you're starting with nothing and you're trying to essentially construct the phrases that you want that say what you're looking for. And so that doesn't mean you could just make it yourself and insert a bunch of words, but it means that you want to make it as concise as possible, but also as sensical as possible when you're cutting it out of the paragraph that you're cutting from. So then that's the first part that I want. The other part is about wealthy and also minorities. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm not going to include some of them because that makes it sound a little weaker. I'm going to just straight say what the authors are saying, which is wealthy citizens are better represented than middle income and poor Americans, and others, and I'm just going to include the and, not others, because others is again referring to the sources, that's referring to the Griffin and Newman evidence. But basically, this person's compiling all of this, so I'm just going to cut the and then include that racial and ethnic minorities, policy preferences are not represented as well as whites. If I really want, while I'm doing this first cut, I can also incorporate what the warrant is, and so I would just cut this and say our results suggest that disparities in representation across groups may occur because citizens prioritize policy representation differently. So I'm not actually going to end up reading all of that, but I have it just in case I want it for my second cut. And so the reason that you do a second cut is because you're going to want to, while you're doing it, you're just going to be highlighting. You press F11 in verbatim. You press F10 as well for just this first cut. But basically, after you do the first cut, I'll use a highlight to pick the second cut. The two reasons I do a second cut is to reduce the amount of words that I'm saying, is to make sure that everything that I'm cutting makes sense and it's actual sentences. And then the other thing I'm doing that's kind of optional is when you do your first cut, you can always try and cut out the warrants. The reason you cut out the warrants is so they're big enough that you can read them, but they're not too big to where you're kind of just essentially lost in what the article is trying to say. So after I do my first cut, I go ahead and press F2, which is what I have bound to the shrink button, which makes it so that everything that's not underlined is actually going to be shrunk. So I can pretty easily be able to read this in a round. But again, like I said, this is a little long for as much as I am just saying. So when I do my second cut, which I'll just scroll down to my actual second cut, I go ahead and highlight the author names to make sure they just stand out and it's very easy to read and I know exactly what's going on. And then in my actual cut, I didn't spend a ton of time on this card, so I didn't end up cutting out the warrant as I did up here with all of this. And I cut a little less in my actual cut because I didn't really know if I was going to do a second cut on this. But essentially, I go back and I highlight each word by word, and I'm looking for exactly what I need, but nothing more. So I end up taking out the most salient preferences. I also take out it says they're responsive, but I take out this preferences, I take out salient preferences, so I only have this one time talking about preferences here, because higher order implies that it's in the order that people want it, and policy responsiveness, I also cut out the versus other spheres of representation, because I didn't think that was adding that much to the card, even though it is important evidence. So after I'm done with all of that, up here you can see the text is a little bigger. I can highlight everything if I want, and just increase the text, so that if I want it to be a little bigger, I can, and then just go back and reduce and do shrink again so that I make sure the contrast is still pretty big. But basically the highlight makes it really stand out what exactly I'm going to read, and for my first speaking partner that he knows exactly what he's going to read and he doesn't stumble over words, and basically he can trust that it's pretty concise when I'm cutting. So then going down here as well, I cut out the middle income and made it just poor because that's all I really needed, and I cut out racial and ethnic because minority implies, racial minority. So essentially cutting all of that, the goal here is to not only be able to know my warrant if my opponent asks for it, but overall try and make my cut as short as possible. So again, if you have any questions, you can let me know about, specific things about what I did when I'm cutting. Again, I think the biggest takeaways are verbatim is extremely critical when you're cutting cards. It makes it so much easier, so much faster. And also just the idea that you're not trying to read a whole news article and explain everything an author said, but rather you need to know exactly what you're looking for and find specific cards that say that. Some teams will go so far as not even read directly from the card and just read short summaries and explaining what the card is saying. So that way, instead of explaining it right here and then saying it again, you're essentially only saying it once. You can do that if you want. I would recommend probably cutting a lot of cards before you should feel comfortable doing that. But essentially, overall, I would say that what's most important when you're cutting a card is to remember that you need to find what you're looking for and you need to know the warrant in the card. If you don't have a warrant, it makes your argument a lot harder to comprehend and to be able to win. So, yep, that's pretty much it for cutting cards. Like I said, if you have any questions, just let me know.